expert is overrated. I just know a lot, but there's a whole lot more out there. And it says Bruce and Blacksburg, that came from long ago on BitNet, I believe, when pre-internet, and it just stopped. So I'm going to be talking about this small 8-mile-long branch line that has a special place among N&W fans. Story's got history, mystery, some deceit, and today it's not going to be full of operating details or rivet counts on rolling stock. That's another whole issue and story. The information's built from newspaper articles from over the years, information and drawings from the archives, correspondence files from Lucius Johnson, who was president of the N&W, and we had access to them. I had access at Virginia Tech when they were there in special collections, and then when they got moved down to GOB East before they got spirited away. Also used the records of Dr. Paul Behringer, who was president of Virginia Tech, and Stuart Castle, who was the longtime business manager and spark plug for a lot of things happening at the university. I'll be reading quite a bit because the words of those days say it a whole lot better than I could. And as it says, how to climb out of the rabbit hole and write a book in a week. It's like, I've got a presentation to do, but I kept finding more and more stuff. So it's like, I've got to stop. Here we go, here's what we've got, and we'll get going. Just to give some background so you have an idea of what was going on. William Black ultimately ended up with a lot of land out of what was originally a patent for the from the Revolution, and he donated enough land to put in a 16-grid square in 1798 for this community. Blacksburg was at a crossroad of the line that came, or trail road that came out of the Roanoke Valley, crossed the ridge, and continued west to Pepper's Ferry and beyond. There was also a road from the main wilderness trail going north and over the mountain into Giles County. They had good water, they had good land, the town started to grow, they had churches, they had schools, or a school, Preston and Olin Institute, and it became a thriving little community. The Virginia and Tennessee Railroad came through nearby Bangs at the time, now known as Christiansburg, with Cambria in the interim. That provided a little more access to the area. The town was actually chartered in 1871. The Methodist school landed the deal to become the land grant school for Virginia. The government sold land, provided the money to the states to create agricultural and mechanical schools to train people in those arts and sciences. That had a big impact on the area. And it went from Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College to the Virginia Agricultural, Mechanical College and Polytechnic Institute in 1896. Because of the mouthful, it got shortened to Virginia Polytechnic Institute, or VPI. And somewhere along the line, Virginia Tech dropped in there. In the 70s, VPI kind of went away, but it's still Virginia Tech. So, to get from the station in Bangs, you had to take a dirt road to Blacksburg. And according to the Richmond News Leader, and this was in 1903, and they say that some Richmond men went to Blacksburg last week. At Christiansburg, one of them took a new, well-made carriage with two exceptionally fine horses. The distance to Blacksburg is 8 miles. The horses made it in 2 hours and a half and arrived in a lather of sweat. It was pitiful to see the poor beasts strain and toil and plunge, taking the risk of a broken leg, a torn tendon, or a hoof pulled off at every minute as they sank knee-deep into the ruts and the sticky mud. The carriage was racked and twisted in every joint, and the fact that it did not fall to pieces is evidence of the soundness of material and workmanship in it. So that was how you got from the train to the agricultural school. When they returned, it took them another 2 hours and 35 minutes. Because of that, there were a number of attempts to improve connections and build a railroad. So in 1874, the Blacksburg Railroad Company was chartered. It allowed for constructing a railroad from some point on the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio, at or near its Christiansburg depot, via Blacksburg to the foot of Brush Mountain. It was again incorporated on March 5th, 1890. Same deal, gave them the right to build from the, at that time, now the Norfolk and Western, to Blacksburg, and if it was advisable, they could extend the line to the New River Division of the N&W at some point in Pulaski County. So they were very ambitious. They were required to start construction within 2 years from March 1890 and complete construction within 5 years. The charter was amended in 1892 and changed the construction requirement from 2 years from the first day of March 1892, with work to be completed in 5 years of the new date. So there we go with that. On October 7th, 1882, W.W. Coe, who was the chief engineer for the Norfolk and Western, went out and toured the line. He met with a Mr. Fitzhugh, who was the chief engineer of the Blacksburg Railroad, and Alexander Black, who was the president. And he wrote a letter to Frederick Kimball in Philadelphia explaining about the line and promoting that it might be a good thing for Kimball to contact these people and talk about a deal. And according to the letter, it was proposed for the railroad to leave the N&W at or near Christiansburg Station and go first to the village of Blacksburg, one proposed line being along the crest of the Allegheny Mountains, the other in order to get in close proximity to the coals of Price Mountain, being more along the watercourses. From Blacksburg, it is proposed to build 2 lines, one in a northwesterly and the other in a northeasterly direction, it being the intention to thus open up the market, the coals and ores of Brush Mountain. So here's Bangs, and it's not really apparent. This is an undated letter or map from Special Collections of Tech. One line goes up the watercourse, beyond Blacksburg and down Tom's Creek, through the gap at Poverty Creek, and then eventually over to Craig's Creek. The other one goes out of Blacksburg that way, along the base of Brush Mountain. And Coe also said that careful instrumental surveys have not been made, and no maps or profiles prepared from actual instrumental examinations. But he worked and assumed that this was his map, and he reported about the high quality of the coal and iron ore. So, we tried again. Blacksburg Railway Company was incorporated in February of 1896, and it was again authorized to operate from the N&W to Blacksburg, and again extend to the New River Division of the N&W and somewhere in Pulaski County. And they were permitted to operate steam, electricity, or any other motive power. And this one, there's an interesting clause in their charter, because the Commonwealth was interested in the railroad because of the college. Section 5 of the charter authorized the governor to hire or lend to the said company such convicts in the Virginia penitentiary as may be available for such time and upon such terms as he may think proper. The Board of Visitors of the college are authorized to donate or lease, as they may think proper, to the said company so much of the land of the Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College as they may think proper for the right-of-way and depot and terminal facilities. Construction was to be started within 2 years of February 1896 and completed within 5 years from that date. On January 27, 1898, 2 years, the General Assembly approved an amended charter to the Blacksburg Railway Company, removed the use of convict labor, but still had the clause about the donation of land from the college. Construction was to be started within 2 years of January 1898 and completed 5 years from that date. Next up was the Montgomery Railroad and Mining Company. It was chartered on February 8, 1898. Same deal, construct a railroad from the N&W through the Price Mountain coal field, at or near the town of Blacksburg, and open up the coal field between James Slusher's coal property and the mouth of the Poverty Branch. It was required to start construction within 2 years of the 1st of April 1898 and complete the work within 5 years from that date. So the theme going on here, and you see charters getting redone because they never got anywhere. Then we have the Salem and Blacksburg Electric Railway Company. That was incorporated in January of 1896, and they were permitted to build a standard gauge railroad, single or double track, starting in Salem in Roanoke County, and running by the most practical and eligible route to the town of Blacksburg. And the company was given all the rights to carry freight, baggage, express, and charge tolls and fares. A search over in the county courthouse through all the deeds turned up nothing about any of these companies acquiring any right-of-way, buying property, or anything else. So a lot of speculation, a lot of expectation, but nothing happened. Finally, we got to 1902. The anthracite was authorized to build a railroad of standard gauge starting in Christiansburg and going to Blacksburg, and they could extend to any point in Montgomery or Giles County. Work began on the road later in that year. On January 10th of 1903, the Roanoke Times reported new road underway. And they said the line from Cambria was being built to the extensive coal fields of Price and Brush Mountains. Fields yield a good, hard, steaming coal. The seams are in some places 8 feet thick, thus rivaling the famous Pocahontas fields. The company has been formed with Professor L.S. Randolph as president, which has bought up thousands of acres of land upon which the coal mines are located. Extensive iron mines are also expected to be developed in the near future. All the heavy grading has been done, and the contract calls to be running in 2 months. The road will go through Blacksburg and will use steam for freight and electricity for passenger service. On April 1st, 1903, the Norfolk and Western Railway granted to the Virginia Anthracite Coal and Railway Company the privilege to put down tracks on a section of the Kingston branch so that the anthracite could get to the Christiansburg. The rental covered at 1.05 miles of track, and they were to pay an annual rental rate of $350. This is where things are a little fuzzy, because at the time, the Kingston branch, this is Roanoke, this is going west, Kingston branch came off in this direction. Now, there's the remains of that. What isn't known at this point is whether the Kingston branch was changed prior to the Virginia Anthracite, or that was part of the deal. But milepost 0 is where the switch took off from the Kingston branch and went across the creek, around the knob, and then across the bridge over the main line. First rails were laid in March of 1903. Roanoke Times reported that they drove their first spike on the line of the railway, and over half a mile of steel was put down. 50 hands are at work putting down the rails, and the officials of the company say that they will have trains running over the road by the 20th of this month, which was March, to the Price Mountain coal mines, with the line expected to be completed to Blacksburg by June 20th. This was the beginning of their hype. They're thinking great things, but didn't quite happen. In March of 1904, the Roanoke Times reported on the mining operations at Merrimack, said they were planning to extend the railroad from Price's Mountain on through Tom's Creek to the new and valuable possessions. The right-of-way through town has been secured, and we hear that the site of a depot has been selected a little way north of Blacksburg Inn on the Jacob Keister property. The story was partially right, because the line was finally extended to Blacksburg in late 1904. On June 28, 1904, the Blacksburg Town Council passed an ordinance allowing the railroad to come into town and construct a station at the corner of Clay and Water Streets. And if there was a trestle over any street, it was required to be tall enough for a vehicle or wagon to pass underneath it. Now here, this was a part of their later proposal, that they wanted to go either this way or this way out to Francisco, where there were iron deposits. They never quite made it. They ended at Blacksburg. But when they got to Blacksburg, September 16th was the big day. And Roanoke Times-Dispatch reported the event the next day in their paper. The Virginia Anthracite Company runs its first train. The excursion started in Christiansburg with a trainload of invited guests. At the invitation of the general manager, a party consisting of Judge A.A. Flieger, W.C. Flagg, J.R. Eoff, W.L. Curran, J.R. Johnson, here we go, J.H. Thompson, W.N. Dunkley, W.F. Talent, R.B. Spindle, and Dr. A.S. Ellett, prominent citizens of Christiansburg, member of the press from the Roanoke Times, and Mrs. J.R. Wilson and Miss Laura Jordan. They boarded the first passenger coach to run over the road. At the station, they were joined by W.J. Payne, who seems to be worthy of an article all by himself. He was a developer, a promoter, and had his fingers in a lot of pies. At that time, he was the vice president. Their auditor, Guy F. Elliott, who was the secretary, and J.W. Walters and G.W. Walters, who were the directors. The train, in charge of engineman A.P. Witt, fireman Grayson Lucas, and conductor C.R. Fagg, commenced its first journey and reached Blacksburg after a delightful run of about 40 minutes. On approaching the latter place, engineman Witt awakened the echoes as well as the natives by a prolonged whistle from his locomotive. and the waving of handkerchiefs and other manifestations of delight from a large crowd which had assembled. The train pulled up to the temporary station. After a stay of half an hour, the return trip was commenced, and they added more people from the from the college, and they were off and running. So here we see the original station, which, if you're familiar with downtown Blacksburg, there's the town hall. Here's Main Street up here, Clay Street, former station, and Blacksburg Motor Company, which is now town offices. So based on this, you've got Clay Street, and this station originally for the Virginia Anthracite was about roughly in that location. They offered frequent service. You could ride local, starting at 7:15, or you could take the express at 10:45. When the line was running, students arriving at the college would get off the train. They had a through ticket. That would get their baggage from Christiansburg to Blacksburg, and they would take a carriage and not worry about waiting for the train. All heard the story about the train was so slow you could get off, pick a bucket of huckleberries along the right of way, and still be able to catch up and get back up on the train. Bit apocryphal, but there is some truth to what was going on. In 1905, the Times-Dispatch had a story about a farmers' institute in Roanoke. And they had a charter train that brought them from Roanoke to the agricultural college. And they boarded the Virginia Anthracite and Coal Railway to Blacksburg. When they got to Blacksburg, the reporter mentioned that there were not enough carriages at Huckleberry Junction, as the VPI boys have named the depot of the new road, to carry the party over the grounds and to the experiment farm. It was also mentioned in the Roanoke Evening News in December of 1905, when they were talking about the coming Christmas holiday. The town is getting on its holiday attire. Santa Claus has sent its presents ahead so as to save extra baggage charges over the Huckleberry. However the name was created, it stuck through the years and continues on as the name of the extensive biking trail that now covers most of the right-of-way. So at Christiansburg, which was the starting point of the line, the Virginia Anthracite signed an agreement with the Norfolk and Western on October 1, 1904, so that they could build a temporary building so that they had a place to shelter passengers and freight during transfers. It was to be used until a definite need and permanent interchange was created. Haven't quite found what the connection was, whether they were able to run to the station, which at that time was the AM and O station there at the grade crossing, or if there was a gap and they had to walk, wagon, carry between the two lines. The anthracite officials were pushing the N&W for a newer, better station. The N&W officials were going back and forth internally about the need for a new station. And there was some question about, well, could we build a wooden station? Would that be adequate? Other arguments were that because of the growing traffic due to VPI and the nearby healing springs, that they really needed a larger station, especially considering the anthracite line was also going to be using the station and sharing some of the cost. They ultimately decided on the Farmville plan and built it to the east of the, at that time, current station. and agreements were drawn up that would allow the anthracite to share the station and use the freight station. And there was a lot of correspondence between the two companies about rates and trackage use and employees and who was going to do what and who was going to pay for what. So you have the Kingston branch coming in here, running track down here to the back of the passenger platform and all the way down to the freight station. And trains. The new station at Christiansburg was reported to Johnson on September 3rd, 1906. The force at Christiansburg has been moved into the new passenger station, and it will be used for the first time by train number 1 today. There was still a lot of back and forth between the N&W and the Virginia Anthracite. The company operated on a shoestring budget. There were instances where they were not making the bond payments as required. They complained to the N&W about some of their rates and rentals. So all that came into play when the new railroad came to town. So here we have our mystery. Roanoke Times in January 1903 carried the story, "First Contract Let, Construction of a Railroad by Mysterious Parties." They were reporting from Bluefield that the first contract for the construction of the new and mysterious Tidewater Railroad is about to be let. There is great mystery concerning the people who are behind this road, and much speculation has been indulged in. It has successfully been Wabash, the C&O, an independent line to the seaboard, and now the latest rumor is that it is owned by Standard Oil Company, which has gobbled up the Hocking Valley and which wants an entrance into this rich virgin coal field. A year later, in a special to the Richmond Times-Dispatch in February 1904, was Dateline Parisburg, and it mentioned the Deepwater Railroad. The story said, "I am informed today that this company has a corps of engineers at Glen Lynn, one at Eggleston Springs, and one at Blacksburg, thus indicating that they will build across the country from Clark's Gap in Mercer County, West Virginia, to Glen Lynn, across New River, and up this stream to a few miles west of Radford, then to cross by or near Blacksburg and down to the Roanoke east, the impression being the Deepwater Company is part of the Wabash system." So there was a lot of press about the railroad, a lot of questions. You've all read H. Reed's story about the Virginian and H.H. Rogers pulling the wool over the eyes of the N&W and the C&O. He said, "For instance, a large number of anglers hopped out of an N&W train with transit fishing poles at a New River gorge between Bell Springs and Glen Lynn, Virginia, on a Sunday in February of 1904. You'd think the C&O and N&W would have recognized the men for what they were, Rogers surveyors, if for no other reason than February can be a lousy time to fish in icy New River." It's a nice story, but it was far from the truth. N.D. Nicholas Mayer, who was the general manager of the N&W, wrote a letter to Johnson. He said, "I beg to report further information in regard to surveys of the Tidewater Railway Company. And in addition to reports given below, I beg to advise that a full express car has been ordered to be placed at Salem tomorrow for movement of Tidewater Company surveying instruments and supplies from Salem to Brookneal on our Durham line." So they knew what was going on. They may not have known all the details, but they knew competition was coming to town. He also wrote that surveys of the Tidewater Railway shows that they have made a location up Tom's Creek, crossing the summit about 2.5 miles northwest of Blacksburg, thence down North Fork Roanoke River to the town of Lafayette, which lies a short distance northeast of Elliston. So this Tom's Creek routing on some of the maps that you will see about the anthracite show remnants of Virginia Railway right-of-way. Mayor also said, "We've just received information that the Tidewater people may run a line up Strubles Creek from New River and cross the divide directly at Blacksburg. Strubles Creek enters the New River at the end of Horseshoe Bend below Pepper." He also mentioned there was another survey that would go up Plum Creek, which starts out here at the east end of Radford, summit south of Christiansburg, then down Elliott's Creek to the South Fork of the Roanoke River at Allegheny Springs. They ended up going with Strubles Creek. But instead of continuing up Strubles Creek towards Blacksburg, they stayed on the south side of Price Mountain, and that put the anthracite right in the crosshairs with, at the time, the Tidewater. The engineers decided that the best way to cross the divide there was to build a 1 mile long tunnel, which was at the top of the grade. And they proposed that the anthracite be raised above instead of having an at-grade crossing, so they didn't have to worry about stopping as they were coming up the grade from Whitethorn. So they signed it. So the anthracite found a contractor, and on June 10th, 1906, after the agreement was signed in February, they hired a guy to do the grading for about 4,800 feet. And he started to work. If you read the article in the Arrow, I went into great detail about all of this, but basically, Lindsay signed the contract. The Virginia anthracite was not doing him right, and he terminated his contract in a dispute with the anthracite, ended up filing suit against the company. In March 1907, the Tidewater Railway Company became the Virginian Railway Company, and under that name, I filed suit in Montgomery County against the anthracite in Chancery Court on October 2nd, 1907. There were lots and lots of court sessions, back and forth, deadlines, things that would be done, should have been done. The anthracite wasn't moving along, but the Virginian was. And they were grading their line all the way between Glenland and Norfolk, but the glitch in the system was this little railroad at the top of their grade. On December 19th, 1907, the anthracite was notified by the Virginian that after midnight that night, their track would be taken up and further use of it would be impossible. There was much consternation in Blacksburg because the VPI cadets were wrapping up their session and getting ready to head home, and the Virginia anthracite passenger train was their only connection with the rest of the world, other than hoping that there were carriages and hacks available. While that was going on, W.J. Payne, who at that time was the president of the anthracite, sent a letter to Johnson under the subject of N&W purchase of Virginia Anthracite and Coal Railway for $225,000. He said, "I stated to you that it would probably cost $5,000 to complete the cutoff to permit the Virginian Railway Company to pass underneath our tracks. There has already been spent on the cutoff over $20,000. All the piers have been built and the plate girders are on the ground. Some excavation work is yet to be done." Johnson declined the offer. On January 24th, 1908, the Merrimack Tunnel, or Allegheny Tunnel, was completed. That next month, the court gave another deadline to the anthracite to take care of its tracks. And at that deadline, the anthracite shall remove its tracks and not occupy said crossing except in the manner provided. They didn't take action at that time. It wasn't until later in June that they got a grading contract, and the matter provided for consisted of a temporary drawbridge that would cross the Virginian. Anthracite was here, Virginian was down here. There wasn't enough clearance, but they put in a drawbridge so they could at least continue to operate to Blacksburg. Bridge went into place in July, and immediately it was a disaster. The anthracite ran its first train over the bridge on July 26th. Besides the regular train, they had a boxcar in front of the engine. And there were a number of people on that boxcar who were affiliated officers with the company. When the boxcar reached the drawbridge, it jumped the track. And the Ellet men, thinking they were in great danger, jumped from the car. And they all suffered various injuries from their landing. So the railroad anthracite limped along until January of 1909, and the Virginia Trust Company, who held interest itself in the railroad and represented various other trustees, they filed suit in Chancery Court in Richmond to have receivers appointed to run the companies, the railroad and the Virginia Anthracite Coal Company. Richard H. Smith, the banker in Richmond, and W.J. Payne, president of the companies, they were appointed receivers. The receivers finally completed the work on the cutoff, and it was put into service on February 22nd, 1909, 3 years after the initial line relocation agreement. With the completion of the cutoff, the original main line was abandoned on the Virginia Anthracite. So that's looking down the grade towards Whitethorn. That's looking towards the tunnel. At one time, the Virginia had a station here. More on that in a moment. The line was cut, but the right-of-way still exists on both sides, and the president of Virginia VPI, Dr. Behringer, started calling for the connection to be put in with the anthracite and the Virginian. And he said, we're offered coal delivered at Christiansburg Junction for $2.50 a ton. We're offered the same type of coal delivered at Shelby Junction on the Virginian, 4 miles from Blacksburg, for $2.25 a ton. So he said if they could get the coal cheaper, they would save money. He said nothing is in the way except the Virginia Anthracite Coal and Railway Company will not make the rail connection at this point. Of course, they're not itching to accept the short haul of 25 cents on the Virginian so long as they can force us to make the long haul at 60 cents from the Norfolk and Western. But they did make the connection using the original anthracite main line from the creek up to towards the mine. And the Virginian erected a 14 by 42 foot frame combination station, which lasted until 1952 when it was replaced by a 10 by 12 telegraph office. On April 26, 1911, the judge in the Chancery Court in Richmond said that the anthracite receivers were not doing very well. There was nothing in the company other than the railroad and their property, and he said it needed to be sold. So they scheduled a sale on the courthouse steps in Christiansburg at noon on June 29, 1911. N.D. Mayer was one of the bidders for the Norfolk and Western. He had been authorized to go up to $100,000 on his bid, and he reported to Johnson on what transpired that day. He said, there were only two persons bidding for the property, myself and a young man whose identity was not known to anyone from whom we could make inquiry. The gentleman registered from Newport, Kentucky, and later secured Pullman accommodations on our train to return to Norfolk. He started the bidding at $500,000 and continued bidding over half an hour. He put in his last bid of $100,000, and the gentleman mentioned increased the bid to $105,000. Mayor said, that's it, I'm done, that's our maximum, do as you please. The commissioners weren't quite sure. They talked to Payne, who was there at the auction, and then decided they weren't going to accept the bid. Mayor continued in his letter to Johnson about it, said they had no little difficulty during the process of the bidding to determine the status of the other bidder, although their impression was he was an authorized representative of the banks who held a majority of the bonds. A couple days later, they got a letter from Jonathan Johnson, who was a Christiansburg attorney. He said, I've been reliably informed by a gentleman who knows him personally that he is one W.J. Naw, treasurer of the Newport News and Old Point Comfort Railway Company, of which W.J. Payne is the president. So it seemed, notwithstanding Mr. Payne's ignorance of the identity of the aforementioned gentleman, he was here in the interest of Mr. Payne. So there's the deceit. They were trying to run up the bid just to improve their standing on the receiving end of the money. Since they didn't accept the bid, they rescheduled the auction, and the N&W bid again up to $100,000, and they won the line. The deal on the auction was that they would get a free title to the property. There were some questions, so until that was resolved, the receivers continued to operate the line. And January 2nd, 1912, the decree was entered in the Richmond court that the Norfolk and Western Railway was the new owner of the Virginia Anthracite Coal and Railway. The plan when the Virginia Anthracite was building into Blacksburg, there's a curve. Here's Main Street, Clay Street. They had a couple choices of where they were going to end. What they ended up with was the station down here, the trestle over, at that time, Water Street and Clay Street, and they had a siding that extended across Main Street to a business there. The N&W looked and said, well, we're going to build on this little rise here. We'll build freight and passenger, and ended up with that station. That's looking back down the tracks from the end of the line towards the coal tipper. They didn't operate an express, but they did run 3 trains instead of 4. So it was still possible to get back and forth between Blacksburg and Christiansburg and continue your journey on the N&W. There has been discussion, and there still needs more discussion about this little Walton train and whether that was the train that then continued on to Blacksburg to run on the branch.
It doesn't say so, but were those mixed trains?
Yes, yes, because they were still switching coal at the mine. They were bringing freight into Blacksburg. They were bringing coal in for coal dealers in the college.
If you have a combine, then they're on that time.
Yeah, yeah. So the line played host to many special passenger movements for the VPI cadets. Many alumni taught classic Thanksgiving Day football game against VMI. were also antics. John mentioned yesterday about greasing the rails. May or not have happened, but there was a report on it. Tradition among the cadets was in May, the sophomores would have a blowout banquet and terrorize the town after the banquet, specifically hunting down any freshmen who did not heed any warnings and were not hiding. The class of 1925 heard the stories, decided we're not going to be a part of that. So they started planning to escape. They had some funds. They contacted the Hotel Roanoke and set up an order for a banquet and dance on May 26th. An order came through and was accepted by the Norfolk and Western for a special train to wait a mile or so outside of Blacksburg. And strictest secrecy was to be observed about the train. According to the newspaper report, the sophomores got a little suspicious and at the last minute discovered the travel plans of the freshmen. It was too late to try and persuade the college authorities to take a hand, take over a train, or tie up the rat class. But they still had some fight left. So a delegation hustled up to a long grade just beyond Blacksburg. And there upon the rails applied the old well-known lard, axle grease, and other things of such nature. Train was heading up a lively gait when it hit that grade, ran up for a little ways, slowed down, and then began to slide backwards. Somewhere back in the bushes, there was perhaps a laughing delegation of sophomores. And all about inside the cars, there were 200-odd men of 25 in momentary consternations. They rolled out windows and doors, ready to do battle or anything else to get that train on its way. Trouble was soon located. The wheels were spinning on the old grease and the engine naturally wouldn't pull. Therefore, because the old engine wouldn't pull, 200-odd freshmen laid a worker's hand on sides of the car, and so the train was slowly pushed up the grade.
I've never heard that story, Bruce. BMI is they're still proud that they did that at some point.
Yeah. So the special disappeared over the year. Triumphant freshmen waved joyful farewell to any sophomore delegation. And a little later, they were parading with a buoyant step through the business section of Roanoke. Unknown, because the report of the paper ended up with no account of the greasing of rails in an effort to keep the freshmen from a banquet of their own had reached Blacksburg, according to reports.
Great story,
Getting close. So, line operated, carried freight, carried passengers back and forth. Operated up until the 1960s, bringing coal into town. Till 1963, when the Norfolk and Western filed with the Interstate Commerce Commission request to abandon 5.7 miles of track from milepost C 3.73 near Christiansburg on the end of the branch at milepost C 8.90 in Blacksburg. If the abandonment was approved, the railroad would build a new tipple and team track near 114, which is now Walmart, Holiday Inn, the mall, all that development. The filing was because of the resolution adopted by the Blacksburg Town Council asking the N&W to get out of town. The move was to facilitate a street relocation project, make available to the town the present station building and right-of-way within the town, and make possible an expansion of the Blacksburg Airport. What was in town was the station, team tracks, and 3 unloading chutes in the center of town. They could unload 3 box cars on the team tracks. They could unload cars under the tipple in muddy conditions. The timber trestle was the original one built in 1904. It had ground level loading chutes with low clearance, and they had slide plate gates operated by levers which were obsolete. They had occasional still special passenger trains, but passenger service had ended in 1958. Interstate less than carload freight was discontinued on the branch in 1963. And on June 22nd, 1964, the N&W was authorized to discontinue all intrastate less than carload freight, other than shipments of 6,000 pounds or more. In addition to getting the right-of-way, the town would also benefit from the donation of the station building. Needed a new town hall and a civic center, and a study decided that that would be the great place to have it. When it all came to pass, they demolished the station, built a town hall, which is the brick building sitting there on the corner of Main and Washington. They built a recreation center elsewhere in town. Then VPI owned land on both sides of the right-of-way, south of town, and if the abandonment was authorized, the N&W would donate this part of the right-of-way, which was 5.3 acres, to the college. This would permit expansion of the VPI airport at the south end of town. Plans for which have been approved, but which are being held in abeyance until the railroad line in the vicinity is eliminated. So there you see the one business that was served across the Main Street, which runs right here. Downtown and the college are this way. This goes to Christiansburg. Again, the team track, which occasionally was blocked by the coal cars, and their load clearance tipple. Not the greatest unloading conditions. And this is Draper Road running to Clay Street. There's a bottleneck, there are occasional accidents there. This largely vacant land is where they built the new tipple and team tracks. The Holiday Inn is here, Walmart's back here, the mall was on this side of 114. The rail line crossed here, and they used that for quite a number of years. That came about because the abandonment process was carefully engineered. There was some opposition in Blacksburg to abandoning the line and the tipples, but they were brought around. When it came time for the hearing in Washington, the N&W loaded selected college and town officials on a special train, business car, took them up to Washington. They were wined and dined and treated right. And then when the hearing was over, they flew them back to Roanoke on Piedmont Airlines. The abandonment was approved, and the Blacksburg Depot was closed in the summer of 1996. Now, they mentioned the airport, which was built pre-World War II, as a training field. Here's Main Street, this is north. They had this short little runway, and then you had the tracks here. 1978, they had built a new runway because this runway, don't know why or how it was located, but it didn't do well with crosswinds. So at this time, the line was abandoned, but the railroad did not impinge on the new runway. The new one was completed in 1992, and that extension is what finally severed the right-of-way, some 30 years after they claimed we need the railroad gone for the airport. there were some people who thought, gee, we've got this empty land. They converted it into a short nature trail, and it's grown from there to where there's the original section from downtown, some relocations and extensions, so you can now go from Christiansburg all the way to Brush Mountain. So the Huckleberry finally got there, but it was on foot and by bicycle, not by train. And if you're really into mountain biking, you can take a trail over Brush Mountain and ride the extensive trail network around Pandavis Pond. I'm running out of time, but there's a lot to talk about this part of it. Norfolk Southern said, we know that there's a desire to extend Amtrak to the New River Valley. Went to the state and said, we'll make you a deal. We'll sell you the Virginian line from Salem to Merrimack, and you can use that to run your Amtrak train to Blacksburg. There's some question about what kind of deal the Norfolk Southern saw coming, and here's a great way to unload our rail line. At any rate, they did lots of studies, made arrangements for improvements in Roanoke to get from the Roanoke station out to Salem. Then they started looking at what it was going to cost for the mile-long Merrimack Tunnel, which, in order to make it usable for modern passenger service, required millions and millions of dollars of work for ventilation, emergency access, to multiple towers from train level to ground level for emergency people to be able to get in and passengers get out in a situation. And they said, no thanks, because it would dead end them at the station they planned by the mall. The other blue sky part of it was they would build a tunnel from Merrimack over to connect to the N&W. That would have been an undertaking and then some. So they had this great plan at that time. They would come out of the tunnel, they would come up going west, cut into the hillside. Right, we understand your plans, we understand you want to eventually get to Bristol. You can run on the N&W side. So those that went on tour yesterday saw what they're doing there at the Christiansburg station. They've worked out all the deals as far as financing. The station authority that was established a number of years ago is going to renovate and operate the original passenger station. And we will have Amtrak service supposedly next year. It will start and stop in Christiansburg after it is turned and serviced here in Radford. So, from beginning to end, we've got the Blacksburg branch. And as I mentioned, Corning, someone asked yesterday, now to find my note. Corning plant is full, as we heard. They get cars in and out, mainly in. And it's gone through a couple iterations. There we go. The plant was opened in 1965, and they produce flat glass for windshields and cooktops. They closed that operation in 1984, but then they reopened in 1988 and have continued operating, building the ceramic substrates for catalytic converters. So Corning is kind of keeping that branch line alive for who knows how long. So, Blacksburg branch, with still more to come.
Did they have any way to turn